Welcome to the first episode of A Common Set of Facts, a project of Independent Indiana. The idea behind this podcast is simple and, frankly, a little ambitious. We live in a moment where big public debates move fast, get polarized quickly, and often run more on vibes than on evidence. The goal of this show is to slow down a bit, create space where we can look at the same set of facts, ask better questions, and reason together about trade-offs, especially on decisions that involve serious public money and long-term consequences. This isn't about dunking on anyone. It is not about partisan talking points. It's about clarity. Because in a healthy democracy and in a well-run state, citizens deserve to understand what's actually being proposed, what the evidence says, and real costs and benefits. My name is Amar Patel. I work in civic and economic development here in Indiana, and I serve on the founding board of Independent Indiana. My day-to-day work is mostly about how public decisions translate into long-term opportunity for people and communities, and that's the lens I'm going to bring to today's conversation and those to follow. Today, we're starting with something high-profile in the Hoosier State, the possibility of the Chicago Bears building a new stadium and relocating to Northwest Indiana. Here's where things stand right now. The Indiana General Assembly is considering legislation that would create a financing framework for a potential stadium development in Lake County. Importantly, there's no finalized deal, no signed agreement, and no complete public financing. What lawmakers are debating is enabling legislation, essentially creating the legal structure that would allow for a deal to happen later. Several key details remain unclear. How much public exposure would taxpayers ultimately carry? What revenue streams would back any bonds? What protections would exist if projections fall short? And how much leverage does Indiana really have versus Illinois? Reporting, including from the Indianapolis Business Journal, has described the proposal as early stage and still developing. At the same time, there's real energy around it. The Bears are exploring options beyond Illinois. Northwest Indiana sees potential opportunity, and state leaders appear interested in positioning Indiana as competitive in major economic development plays. So instead of reacting emotionally, pro or anti, today we want to ask, what are the facts? What does the research actually say about stadiums? And what trade-offs are we making if we move forward? Which brings me to the big overarching question I'm most interested in exploring. If Indiana were a business evaluating this stadium deal purely on the merits, expected return, risk, opportunity cost, would we make this investment? And if not, what does that tell us about why we're actually considering it? From there, we'll examine how stadiums actually do economically, what they might do socially, and what it would mean to pursue a deal like this in a defensible way and in the public interest. I'm joined today by two exceptional leaders in the Hoosier State who are well positioned to help us think through this issue with clarity, Jay and Mike. So before we dive in, I'd love for each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and tell listeners a bit about your background and how you come to questions like this. Mike Hicks, let's start with you.
Yeah, my name is Mike Hicks. I'm an economist at Ball State University. I've spent 25 years or so studying state and local economic policy with a pretty big focus on why businesses and households locate where they do. And so that touches across regulatory, state tax policy, human capital, the full suite of things that might bear on a question like this, and is important to most of the decision-making, I think, that the General Assembly here in Indiana and local governments undertake.
Thank you, Mike. Jay.
Hello, my name is Jay Chaudhary. I am a recovering lawyer. By background, I spent 10 years in the world of civil legal aid, and then spent 5 years in the Holcomb administration as the director of the Division of Mental Health and Addiction. And I left that job in late 2024. And since then, I've been working on a number of sort of civic and intellectual and programmatic pursuits, kind of all clustered around the exploration of, civic and mental well-being. So glad to be here.
Two leaders exceptionally well suited to help us think through this issue with facts, with clarity, and with discipline. Thanks for being here, you two. So first, let's set the table. Before we get into opinions, let's start with you. You'll ground us. What is Indiana actually considering here with the Bears? And what's the current legislative framework, the latest you've seen, allow? And what does it not specify?
Sure. So I think that before that, you have to probably go into the Bears' current stadium situation. So the Bears play and have played for a long time at Soldier Field, which is a stadium in a beautiful location right on Lake Michigan in downtown Chicago, but is also in pretty dramatic need of repairs, at least according to them. And so they've been going back and forth with Illinois for a while on a stadium, and it's the details are I'm not super familiar with, but essentially it comes down to how much public funding are they going to be able to access to build their new stadium, and they are at this point dissatisfied with what they say they're getting from Illinois, and so they've started exploring other options, including a potential stadium in Northwest Indiana, which listeners probably know is kind of culturally and economically considered part of the greater Chicago area. So in order to do that, or in order to induce the Bears to move, Indiana is going to have to provide a package of tax breaks and other economic incentives to convince the Bears that this is in their best interests. And in order to do that, that will require legislative action. And so far, Senate Bill 27, outlines and creates a stadium authority in Northwest Indiana that would be responsible for acquiring land, building the stadium, issuing bonds for a period of up to 40 years to finance the project. Mike can probably explain more about what that means. This has passed the Senate, with only 2 dissenting votes, and is now under consideration in the Indiana House.
All right. So we're in the legislative process. This bill is under consideration to create an enabling function to help move the process forward.
Yeah. So it doesn't appropriate any money, but it allows this new authority it would create to use different municipal financing functions to bring public money to bear for this, for the stadium, pun very much intended.
So public dollars have not been committed in this legislation. It's setting up the legal framework, the legal structure to potentially do so out into the future. And so that bill is moving through, is now in process in the House. And we shall see sort of how that moves forward. But it begs the question, right? There's an assumption around this kind of deal, implicit perhaps, that this type of stadium, this type of economic development play drives economic growth. So Mike, let's come to you. There's been a pretty consistent finding in the academic literature on deals such as these pro sports stadiums that they are not a reliable economic development strategy. Why does that finding persist despite years, decades of these types of deals across the union? Even after decades of these deals, new initiatives, including mixed use developments as part of them, the same finding seems to persist. Can you explain those findings to us and why you think they persist in the ways that they do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to begin by saying I think for the remainder of this episode, we need to refer to them as the Hobart Bears, just for clarity, or the Gary Bears. I'm not sure precisely how this is and out. So yeah, I think the short answer is why has what is essentially a scientific finding persisted for 40 years, despite all kinds of improvements in methodology and disputes amongst scholars and changes in the way these things are financed, is probably because they're right. That's sort of the nature of this sort of work.
Yeah.
And so it's good to back up a little bit and think about through this, because if you see a place that has a stadium, they generally are doing well. The Saturdays before football games, they're vibrant activities. They draw 50, 60, 80,000 people, 92,000 if it's a University of Tennessee stadium each game day. Economic activity will occasionally blossom up around them, although one can drive to Indianapolis and see that that's not always the case.
Yeah.
And so you see this economic activity here. You say, well, why haven't, what's going on here? Well, I think there are several reasons for this. So first of all, they're often, remember, this is a private entity just trying to make money, the Hobart Bears. And so their interest is to maximize return to their business. They have a lot of ancillary business as well. If you're relocating the Bears, the economic activity from one county in this large, sprawling Chicago metropolitan statistical area to another county, 40 miles away, that's not going to relocate households. Players aren't going to change their residence. It's not going to do anything in that metro area differently than it does. Maybe there'll be 40, 50,000 additional people could move into the stadium each Saturday, with 7 games or 8 games they play a year. And then there may be other things that you could do with the stadium over the remainder of the year, play high school games or something else, depending on the structure of the stadium. But generally relocating within an MSA is just not going to cause any large shift of economic activity. The studies that look at this look at a couple of questions. The first one is, what happens to construction impact? Because we know that this is going to be built over a couple of years, maybe 3 years, like the Lucas Oil Stadium. And you could do all kinds of studies about what happens to construction employment and earnings and all that sort of thing. Or you could just go to any quickly available website, the Federal Reserve Economic Data site, pull up construction employment in the Indianapolis metro area during the period that the Lucas Oil Stadium was built, and you'll see there's no change in net employment.
Yeah.
So what you really observe in that construction is economic activity being shifted from building residence or hotels or some other building into constructing the stadium. There's no net shock to the economy. It's a transient movement of people who would be doing something else otherwise. And so I think generally you can discount that. That doesn't mean it's not a good economic activity. These people are probably going to get paid more to work on the stadium, but the benefit then is their incremental wage, another $1 or $2 an hour, not the full count of 1,000 workers a year, which is typical in the studies promoting these sorts of activities. And the second question is there going to be durable economic activity? Is there going to be, again, people moving? Is gross domestic product for this county going to be higher? Are people going to move here? Are they going to be more productive workers? That's the source of growth. People aren't sitting around Gary sucking their thumb waiting for the Bears to come so they can open a restaurant. They're doing something else right now. And so I think there's very little indication, particularly the movement within the metro area, that there's going to be an effect. And we're not the only people doing this. The Washington, D.C. area is also going through the same discussion with the Commanders in Maryland. And there was a nice editorial in the Washington Post a few weeks ago that cited some of my work in that on the invisibility of the benefits. And then the third question, which I think is the most salient question, is does the movement of this economic activity to Hobart from Soldier Field generate fiscal benefits for the residents? And generally you would say, if you're moving a big facility here, a data center or an Amazon warehouse or whatever, even if it doesn't bring employment changes that are sort of substantive, it should increase the capital stock of that area, provide more money for tax dollars. And so the challenge is that going to happen? And in the structure that we normally see, the one that Jay just described, generally the state and then the local government are going to essentially give away not just some direct dollars initially to help structure and construct this, but they're going to give away tax revenue for the next 40 years, right? Which means whatever fiscal benefits likely would accrue to Lake County or Hobart as a consequence of this could well be negative. Just because that property has an opportunity cost, something else could go there as well. And so if we're thinking about the efficacy of a stadium, you got to think about the short-term impact, the permanent impact, and then the fiscal impact. And I think that's a pretty rough road to hoe. And I think that's why there are literally dozens of economists who I've seen at conferences and know most of them who hate each other and fight and want to defeat each other with academic papers and in conferences tend to agree that these new stadiums, particularly the ones with the big fiscal incentives, aren't generating benefits of consequence to the communities that they go into.
So we're not seeing a big population move from, say, Chicago, Illinois into Indiana as a function of this. We're still within the same MSA. People aren't going to move at scale. Workers.
Right. Well, think about who's operating that, who's engaged in this. These are professional football players and players on the team and
corporates.
Right, their headquarters. And so, could you see an increase on Saturdays, people working at that area
Yeah.
in concessions or something like that. Yeah, absolutely. But these are not sort of permanent big jobs that would cause people to relocate as a consequence of that. If they're not already living here, but I would suggest living in Lake County is probably less expensive and nicer than living in downtown Chicago. But moving your
Yeah.
location a little bit is not going to change those location decisions.
And then to the
Fundamental.
last point you made, the incentives that states or municipalities are giving to lure this stadium, this professional team to play their games, and in our case, Hobart, it's a wash or worse with the incentives and the fiscal incentives that we're sort of giving. If you look out over several decades. So if that's the case, if the economics are fundamentally weak, why do states still do this?
Yeah. Yeah, if I could weigh in here. First of all, Mike, I think if we just set up economist cage matches, in the new stadiums, perhaps we might be able to
Huge.
break even.
Huge.
I would pay good money, to see Mike against Oren Cass, for example. But no, I think it's interesting and a really good question, Amar, about why this persists. I think there's so many different dimensions to this. One which I think we should table for later on in the conversation is the whole collective action problem here between states competing against other states. It's sort of a subset of the larger economic development issue more broadly. But I think specifically sitting here, we're all in sort of the greater Indianapolis area. I know Mike is a little further out maybe, but um, Indianapolis's civic story, right? At least the one that's told and believed by a lot of folks, is that sports in particular rescued this city, from irrelevance, right? Like sports built this town. There's been documentaries about it. You go to any conversation talking about the history of the city, and within the first 5 minutes, inevitably, the idea that our civic forefathers decided to use sports as a way to put us on the map, comes up all the time. And and I think there's some truth to that story, that sports, both professional and amateur, really kind of gave Indianapolis a kind of exit velocity, where you can argue that maybe this city is actually an exception to the overall rule that Mike says, and I believe, that all of his colleagues also say, where this doesn't make sense for municipalities. I think part of that, and I don't know about the numbers, right, which kind of brings us to, I think, the main argument in favor of things like this in general, which I think for reasons that we can talk about don't really apply here, which is that the numbers may not make, crystal clear sense or total sense, but there's something ineffable, something indescribable. There's something about civic pride and strengthening the community fabric that sports tend to bring to communities. And I think that's true of Indianapolis. I think it's less true frankly, of moving the Bears from Chicago to Hobart. Although Portage, I will say, also has just made a bid as well, so it might be the Portage Bears. There might be some debate there. So I don't think that's true for the reasons Mike mentioned. This is within the same MSA. It doesn't really change anything. These are Bears fans that get Bears games already, right? Changing where the stadium is, I don't think would really meaningfully alter that. So then I think you come down to, I think, the really interesting point, which is politics. So this is all being driven by politicians. Governor Braun has come out strongly in favor of this. All relevant legislative leaders have come out in favor of this. Local politicians have come out in favor of this, whether it's the mayors of Portage and Gary and Hobart or whoever.
Yeah.
And this, I think, is the most interesting part of this, which is that, look, like, state and local government is really, really hard, and it's really hard right now. Like and I know this from working in it. I know it from observing it. It's a lot of decisions that leave a lot of people feeling upset, regardless of which way you end up going. Like, if you want to increase services to one group, you probably have to cut somewhere else. If you want to move money to one priority, it means you have to pull it from somebody else. People get mad. The benefits don't show up in 1 year or 2 years. They may show up 5 to 10 years later. Even if they do show up, they're hard to figure out, hard to talk about, hard to explain. None of that is the case when you're talking about a giant stadium. It's something concrete. It's something you can point to and say, I did that. I built that.
Yeah.
And that's something that you can understand because of the rest of the job being how it is, that might be really attractive to politicians.
So Jay inserts an important point here where if the economics are weak and Mike's making an argument that the fiscal policy here is weak, what are the other incentives that are driving this behavior? One is a set of potential political incentives. In a world where there's significant trade-offs in the eyes of an elected leader on sort of investing in this priority is to divest from this priority, you will inevitably have people in the citizenry and voters upset, right? Is that necessarily the case with this type of deal? So, Mike, you've studied these types of deals all over the country. Talk to us a bit from your perspective about the political incentives of these types of deals, and this is where we get into opinion. Do you believe that's part of what's driving some of the decision making in the legislature and out of the governor's office, as well as some of the city managers and mayors across the state?
Oh, certainly. I mean, I think Jay's 100% right. And it's, for particularly this one, because I think the probability of this happening is like close to me making the NBA finals as a walk-on in the next few weeks.
I've seen you play basketball. You're pretty damn good.
Yeah, I'm spectacular. And is that 9-inch vertical leap gets them all the time. And so I feel like it's very easy to just vote for it and move on and tip the debate. Indiana has been poking Illinois in the eye for 100 years. We're going to keep doing it for 100 years. They do it back. And so it's a low-cost way to tweak them. It's certainly more cheaper than the whole study commission to absorb the 32 counties and the impoverished southern part of Illinois. So yeah, I think that's certainly the case. And I'm actually very susceptible to what Jay's argument is that, there's always an ineffable, more difficult to measure. I'm an economist. I think we can measure everything. It just gets more sketchy, more difficult to do so. That is that, having a football team matters. We all care about the Colts here.
Yep.
Even I, as a native Baltimorean, care about the Colts. And then we're enthusiastic about this. And it's difficult to measure that civic pride, the participation of that, what's going on with it. But that's the same argument that we have about a park system or improving the Monon Trail.
Yeah.
Perhaps improving schools. We don't always have a really clear benefit cost ratio in the short run. Or maintaining the streets at a better level. So basic public services sort of do that. And I kind of agree, Indianapolis has done a very good job of clustering sports, the NCAA, and, we have good collegiate athletics that really complement all that. At the same time, you drive east for 2.5, 3 hours, you get to Columbus, Ohio, that has minor league hockey team. And they're actually growing faster than Indianapolis is, is one of the more robust metropolitan areas in the Midwest. Indianapolis is doing quite well. So, and I think teasing out the causal inference there is something. But again, and I think Jay's right. Having the Colts appear here, having out of thin air from somewhere else. Maybe that works. Moving in and out of the MSA isn't going to make much of a difference. And I think, again, the debate it offers a good opportunity to walk through the decision-making process that government has to make, which is enormously more complex than a business. Business leaders, whenever they get on like a university board, right? Or when I was an Army officer, we would have civic leaders come and spend a day with us. And they're like, oh my God, I had no idea how complex. You're planning a meal for, you like the biggest restaurant in Indiana is at like Purdue or IU or Ball State. So, we're eating, housing, doing all this. There's no profit margin for us to follow. We're looking at difficult to measure things that affect people's lives generations from now.
Yeah.
So the government does the hard things. The private sector does things that have a profit motive. I'm a huge free market guy. I love to think about that. And it really is an important aspect of what we do. But this whole issue of the Hobart Bears moving here is a good place for us to think about the benefit and cost calculus that a city like Portage or Gary or Hobart would undertake to consider this, and why the legislature might have to think through some of these things and what they might be giving up, and what does it do for Hoosiers, because you're asking people in Shelbyville to pay for the Hobart Bears, and that's a big equity issue, or you're asking for kids who will be born for 20 years to continue pay taxes on it. Those are tough questions.
So we're going to come to that. I want to ask it as we get closer to the close, an opportunity cost sort of question, but I do think we have an example, a template sort of example to reflect on, and might be sticky for the listeners. And that's Lucas Oil Stadium as a template here, or a potential warning. So Lucas Oil Stadium is often held up in central Indiana, and perhaps more broadly as a success story. What lessons should we be drawing actually from that deal? And what lessons might be misleading as we consider applying those to the Bears?
Well, I don't know the numbers. I do think it's interesting, and I'll defer to Mike, pretty quickly here. How many events does Lucas Oil host a year? I mean, the answer is probably somewhere like 20 to 25, right? Like that's probably a generous estimate. You think eight NFL games, handful of concerts, some, state high school football games,
Oscar Jam, et cetera. Yes.
Yeah. Every now and then NCAA tournament games.
Yeah.
And then you compare the area on Lucas Oil Stadium, for example, to the area around Gainbridge Fieldhouse, which is the Pacers arena. And this is not a one-to-one or apples-to-apples comparison, but just looking at the built environment around those two, it's clear that even though the NFL is the dominant behemoth, not only in sports, but really in the American culture, writ large, that it's just not a great deal for the surrounding area. And I think that's something we missed too, which is that, basketball is 41 games a year. It's a smaller place. You could hold way more concerts there. You can do way more stuff there. It's just the utility of a giant stadium is just inherently limited, partly by just how giant it is. But I don't know about the numbers. That's Mike's job.
Mike, walk us through the numbers.
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, I think the conclusion is that construction for that, from a public sector standpoint, costs the taxpayers money.
Yeah.
But I also think there's an equity issue that is more important than just that. So we lose money if we were to build a park in a depressed part of the Marion County, and were to eliminate some buildings, build a nice park, maintain it, police it. It would be a place for people to enjoy. Would probably lose some money on that in the short run. Over the long run, things may be better. So if you're building a suite of amenities in a community, some things are gonna work out better than others. The challenge that I always have with these sorts of things, and I've gone to 3 or 4 games there. If my income's in the top 5% of Hoosiers. I wait till the Colts are doing really badly to buy tickets, and then I buy them really high up, because I'm bringing my sons with me coming home from college or the armed services. And so the cost, the people who are undertaking that Colts experience in that stadium are really the state's elite, people who can afford season tickets.
Yeah.
And those are, fine people, but it just is, again, very difficult to justify taxpayer subsidy to what is not just the richest sport in America, but the richest sports franchise in history. You could easily afford to do that. They're simply, and the Colts give back a lot to Indiana, but they also demand an awful lot when they moved here, and have continued to demand improvements, and will continue to demand it. We're 25 years away from a new stadium being built somewhere in Indiana, making the same argument. Are they going to go to Hamilton County? Are they going to move? And it's actually naive to think that Hamilton County won't make a pitch for them.
Right.
And so, and convince a lot of legislators to vote for them, to move them out of Marion County. And so it's the sort of same dynamic. So when you think about these things, I don't think there's any chance of the Chicago Bears moving to Hobart. If it cost Indiana $1 billion or $2 billion in tax incentives, spread over 30 or 40 years, that's probably not going to be worth it certainly not going to be worth for most of the taxpayers involved. Then I think when you're thinking about investing public dollars, you're going to try to maximize the benefit to everybody. Now, yeah, that doesn't mean you don't support the opera. I've never been to an opera. I expect the people who go to operas are, very different than me, have much better taste in music. And so, I'm not suggesting that because you're affluent that you wouldn't want to have public dollars supporting your lifestyle or your interests. I'm just saying that I think it's a very keenly important thing to do in an environment where we've cut spending on schools for 16 years now.
Yep.
The amount of money we're spending on public education for higher ed is a third lower in inflation adjusted terms than it was in 2010. So now you're saying we're going to turn around and essentially spend what could radically change the lives of a lot of Hoosiers for the next 30 years on a football stadium 40 miles from the old one that won't have any real economic impact on, and certainly change very few lives in Indiana.
So Mike, I want to, let me jump in here because I think it's really, you said something, we should dance the opportunity cost problem, which I think is really important too. I think it's really important to hone in on this hypothetical that I think is probably not that hypothetical of the Colts moving to Hamilton County, because I think it says something about the kind of leverage and relationship between the private and public sectors right now in America. It just seems to mean, whether or not this is borne out in the numbers, it's definitely borne out in the feelings and the vibes, which is that it seems like a lot of people feel like it's a one-way street, right? Like we have to bend over backwards to provide tax incentives or, even handouts to public companies or to large publicly traded companies or giant profitable corporations to do things that are in their best interests anyway. And we don't get nearly enough returns to justify that. And that seems to be what drives our economic development philosophy writ large. So I know this is not a conversation about that, but I think it's an important placeholder for maybe a future conversation about whether that's the right approach at all to the relationship between government and the private sector.
So Mike, you absolutely. So Mike, you started to do this. Let's sort of the opportunity cost question, right? So if the state of Indiana, and to be clear, what's working its way through the legislature right now is creating an enabling function. It is not committing hard dollars just yet, right? But presumably, if this moves forward, we'd be saying that the state of Indiana has the fiscal capacity to subsidize a major NFL development, right? If not, if we have the capacity to do that, presumably we have the capacity to make other types of investments. So I'm curious from both of you, what in alternative investments you'd be making, and Mike, to your point, that benefit the greatest number of Hoosiers and at the greatest ROI. What investments would you be making with that $1 or $2 billion over that couple decade time horizon?
I actually think that's like the simplest softball question you can offer an economist, and that is investing in education, starting with preparation for third grade reading tests, preparing more children to be successful in middle school and high school, paying for a higher proportion of those to take the classes, the AP classes, that STEM and science and math classes that prepare them to be successful in college. And that alone would drive benefits that are orders of magnitude, not 20% bigger, but 300% bigger than $1 billion spent on a stadium over 40 years. And the ROI on that for the individual is substantial. The ROI on government in terms of reduced healthcare costs or reduced incarceration rates on longer returns to income is huge. So that's an easy one. People.
I would say a really important thing that is important to people is health, right? And we're a remarkably unhealthy state in a remarkably unhealthy country, and there's lots of lots of reasons for that. I don't, it's a lot of it has nothing to do with the decisions made in this state in the last, 5, 10, 15 years. But I think some of it does. And I think things that we can do to make ourselves mentally and physically healthier uh, is as important, as anything else. And there is a really important role for state government there. And so money that's taken away to do other things, I think takes away from that really important role.
Okay, so this bill is making its way through the legislature, right? So our legislative leaders, by and large, have suggested they are in favor of at least creating the enabling mechanism to pursue the Hobart or Portage Bears. The executives in state and local government and the relevant local municipalities have signaled they are interested in favor as well. So this might move forward. Whether the Bears truly play ball here or not, or are using us as negotiating leverage, we shall see. We have our opinions there. But it seems as though our officials are going to move this forward or try to move this forward. So let's give them some advice on how to do so as responsibly as possible if that's a decision they're making, on our behalf, right? So if the state of Indiana is to pursue this deal, what principles would have to be true in said deal for you to say, this is defensible, this is transparent, and this is in the public interest, if at all?
Well, let me begin. I just think, right, transparency is really important. That's just a straightforward process of public debate and open sharing of arrangements, which is something that negotiators in the business side don't like to do because it would unmask generally particularly beneficial payments to businesses.
Yeah.
But I think equally important would be simply, let's hold the local government harmless. Let's say we're going to, ensure that the Hobart Bears pay a property tax rate that's the highest the highest value that property would use if the Bears weren't there.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe you get them a 10% break or a 15% break, but if they're going to invest all of this capital in new building, and it's a big generator of revenue for them and their team and their box office and for the NFL in general, then certainly that the local government ought to be held harmless. And then if the state's putting money into it, what that does is it means that the states, the other legislators around the state are going to say, look, I'm happy that Hobart's done this, but you got to provide some benefit to me. And so I think if you just hold the local element harmless, that kicks it to a real debate within the legislature, then I think would make it fairly hard to allocate resources. Just the fact is that the local government has property tax, the state has sales tax and some income tax. And I think generally if you're making them debate that in the state house, that would be a good thing.
Jay?
This will make Mike's economist heart turn black here, but I would say, short of some version of like the Green Bay Packers being owned by, the people of Indiana, I would say this is a bad deal without that happening. I just think as we are embarking on what I think is a pretty interesting and important new age of AI dominance and increased concentration in a lot of our different markets. I think we have to start having different conversations about ownership and benefit. I can't think of a better example than, an NFL team that sort of socializes all the risk and privatizes all the profits, which is essentially what happens.
Okay. We've now reached the conclusion of our first episode of A Common Set of Facts. Our sincere hope to our viewing and listening audience is that you understand this issue with greater depth. You understand, have heard the various points of evidence to support and refute the direction that our policymakers seem to be headed in, and that you feel more informed around this issue in the most important role that exists in our state, and that is ours as citizens. So thank you so much. Jay Chaudhary, thank you for joining us. Mike Hicks, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
With that, we'll call it.